me go ahead and introduce Dr. Debbie Sturm. So Debbie was a 2008 graduate from UNC Charlotte's Counseling Education Program, licensed professional counselor. She's also a professor at James Madison University, contributing faculty for Walden University as well. Her clinical specialties include trauma, community violence, family systems, and nature connectedness. She has graduate coursework training and teaching in environmental advocacy, environmental education, climate resilience efforts, environmental justice, and communication strategies. She's a member of ACA's Climate Crisis Task Force and Human Rights Committee. She received the 2013 CASIS Award for Outstanding Teaching and 2020 CASIS Cortland Lee Social Justice Award and the 2021 Counselors for Social Justice Climate Justice Award. She's a trained member of the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. And in 2017, Dr. Sturm wrote the first article on climate and mental health to appear in ACA's Counseling Today. Since then, she has published 2 book chapters and 2 encyclopedia entries on the impact of climate on mental health. She has produced a dozen, including in-press peer-reviewed journal articles, delivered 14 conference presentations, and presented to nearly a half a dozen state counseling associations on nature connection, climate justice, and climate-related issues. She is deeply passionate about expanding this conversation among counselors across the country. So Dr. Sturm, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm very intrigued, and I was from the very get-go, and just really excited to hear from you here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. Probably the most important work that I do these days is just having these conversations, because this is an absent conversation in our field. And I think we're starting to actually get some traction and more people interested. And my hope is that in doing so, we're talking more, we're coming up with solutions, we're figuring out how to get engaged with clients, but also in our communities and with our students in the next generation, because as those of you on the West Coast right now know, I mean, this is very real and happening right now. It's happening near you and really near many of us in a lot of different ways. So I'll give you a little bit of the background that brought me to climate work. Oh, here, let me do this before I get too far. I have a Google Doc there with the slides for this. I prefer to have the conversation with you, but if you're visual and you'd like to have some slides to go along with it, they are there for you. And so you're welcome to open those and follow them, or just be here for the conversation. So who am I? I'm a professor at James Madison University in Virginia, and we're in the Shenandoah Valley, which is an incredibly beautiful place. Our impact from climate change is not terribly significant yet, except for the fact that we don't have particularly strong winters anymore. And so sort of our climate change poison is the increase of vector-borne diseases, particularly Lyme disease, which really impacts your willingness to sort of be in the natural world. We are without a doubt overrun by ticks and other strange creepy crawlies that are one of the natural outcomes of a changing climate. We are not in a fire zone, we're not in a flood zone, we're not in hurricane territory, but that's sort of what our thing is here. And I recognize that everybody has something in their own environment that is changing rapidly and is really concerning. And so a few years ago, I started sort of stomping my feet. So those of you who are interested in leadership and advocacy, I'm going to make sure I weave a significant amount of that in here, because I do think this is about leadership and advocacy. It's about finding your pathway that makes sense to you and figuring out, like, how do you bring voice to it? How do you connect others to it? So I really want that to be your biggest takeaway, is that you have a place where your voice and your passion and your conversations matter. For me, a couple of years ago, when I was at UNC Charlotte, and Dr. Itten was there, and he was on my dissertation, but it was a long time ago. But when I was there, one of the professors, I was complaining about how there wasn't enough social class topics in textbooks. And he looked me right in the face and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And I thought, I can't do anything about textbooks. And sure enough, did my dissertation on social class. And then I went on to write a book about social class in counseling. So that sound of what are you going to do about it resonated with me forever. And a few years ago, I was kind of complaining to a friend of mine who was on the ACA Human Rights Committee that ACA needs to do something about climate change, that social workers already had and that APA already had, and that we've done nothing. And he looked me right in the face and had the audacity to say, what are you going to do about it? And so within about a month, I met with the ACA Human Rights Committee, of which I'm now the chair somehow. So sometimes you have to watch out what you say because you end up doing things. But I met with the ACA Human Rights Committee. I kind of pitched this as a human rights issue. Their chair agreed wholeheartedly. She's one of my biggest collaborators right now. And we took that forward to Governing Council and had them adopt a statement of climate change as a human rights issue. And then once they did that, we were able to advocate with then President Simone Lambert about getting a working group. And then eventually our working group got turned into a task force. And our biggest goal has been information, making sure that there is a space for resources and conversation in the counseling field. And the one thing that I've noticed is the more that I talk to people, the more that I realized, and it surprised me, is that we started with really small groups of people showing up at conferences or in webinars and things, but consistently, counselors said, climate change is important to me, and I have no idea what it has to do with our work. And so that's been the consistent conversation for years now. And we were able to support that with the help of Ryan Reese, who's at Oregon State Cascades. We did a very large study with counselors, social workers, and psychologists around the country. And the same thing came out. The group had a pretty high belief and commitment to climate change and had no idea how it intersected with their practice. In fact, only 5% said that they address climate change in their work with clients. And so these are people from all over the country, places that are flooding, places that are getting hit by multiple hurricanes and fires, and they still aren't sure how it shows up in the counseling room. And so for us, that really took me back a number of steps consistently of, we're starting from a conversation. We're starting from making the connections. Whereas I thought when I first got into this work that this was about big movement and change and how we can get involved in advocacy and changing policies and, interventions and all sorts of things. And instead it was like, we got to make the connection. And so consistently we found that the more people that we talk to, the more people are interested in making the connection. And now that's growing towards, and now what? And so we're seeing a little bit more amongst sort of like our repeat participants of, now what do I do? Now that I see the connection, what do I do? So I want to take some time to really talk a little bit about that connection and just add a whole bunch of stuff here. And so my tendency is to give you a lot so that you can figure out what speaks to you, because what we really desperately need is people that have something that speaks to them. So I'll give you a whole bunch and you see what speaks to you.
Hey, Debbie,
yeah.
Real quick, can I jump in and just say that I think the Google Docs the permissions need to be adjusted because they're getting the access denied deal or whatever. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's great. I can do that really quick. So you've got it. Restricted, change viewer. Anyone on the internet can view this link. Okay. Let's try this again. All right, you got it? Oh, good.
Looks like it's good.
All right, excellent. I'm glad. So I put here sort of in there, I put the ACA Advocacy Competencies. And one of the reasons is I ground so much of what I do in these. And I just finished so 3 minutes before we all met, I finished with my doctoral students leadership and advocacy class. And we've been working on the ACA competencies and realizing that these are not linear or logical or ordered, that we actually find different ways into the competencies just sort of based on our own individual skill sets, our passions, and where we feel like we can make a difference. And then we engage with them in ways that make sense for the cause, for our partnerships, for our stakeholders. So I like to use the competencies as sort of a framework, but also recognize that there's a lot of movement and fluidity within them. So I'll talk just generally about the climate crisis itself. And, I suspect that many of you are very aware of the climate crisis. If I can put it into sort of mental health context, I think that will help as well. So first of all, NASA describes the climate change as it affects the environment, natural resources, economy, and all aspects of life and all nations in the world. It basically impacts everything around us at all times for all people. And that can be broken down in a number of ways. If you're interested in getting involved in this in some capacity, I can't more strongly recommend the Climate Reality Project, which is Al Gore's thing. And they're still doing online training for that. It gives you probably the most comprehensive scientific overview of the changing climate, as well as sort of the human effects of it. So not just like what we've caused, but also what is this doing to our lived experience from a human rights perspective and just a lived experience. And so as far as like a knowledge source, that training that goes on for a couple of days is pretty powerful, and it teaches you how to be an advocate, which means it also teaches you about how to develop your own story and how to share and articulate your story as a way to bring forth a cause. So anyway, just saying that because it's really good and it's overwhelming. And I think that's one of the first things I took from it, is that when you do a really deep dive into climate science and understand what's happening, it's extraordinarily overwhelming. And many times people will turn away because it's just too much to process and you don't know what to do with that. And so a natural tendency is to kind of look away. And when I was doing that training, we were meeting in small groups according to our state. Many of the people in my state training group said it was getting too hard to look. And from a mental health perspective, from a counseling perspective, just from an overall how to be an advocate perspective, it's important that we're able to figure out how to calibrate our internal resources enough to hear the fullness of the truth and to also look at the fullness of the solutions and the hope. So I'll kind of package that in a little bit later, but when we look at climate change, we really want to be able to look at the fullness of what's happening. So a couple other things, like we consider climate change a threat multiplier. And one of the slides that I presented is a multiply determined crisis that requires systems thinking and more abstraction than understanding of concrete facts. So basically, climate change is something that is so complex that we sort of have to have the mental flexibility to take in system-wide implications while also looking at the actual impact around us. It's a triggering and emotional topic because of the overwhelm and also the sadness. When we have a sense of connection to our natural world, to animals, to places, to vulnerable populations and each other and our neighbors, that empathy brings out the pain of the reality of what we're facing. So know that sort of sitting in this emotional reaction is a deep sense of empathy and connection that gets triggered when we see the harm. It's also constantly changing. And so conversations, you can even think about the terms, like 20 years ago, it was global warming, which I will always say was a terrible idea because it makes things think like it's because we're getting warmer. It doesn't really fully explain why some winters are colder and some places are wetter. It just kind of simplifies it to a way that allows people to misconstrue. But we went from global warming to conversations about climate change. We've had conversations on climate crisis and now climate emergency. All of those are really important, and it just illustrates that even the terminology has changed, much less what it means, but the terminology shifts and the implications over what we're understanding all the time shifts. That's overwhelming. When something is that big, you want grounding facts and figures, and we don't have them because it's constantly evolving into an unknown. And then also, the other thing is like really looking at climate change challenges our views of ourselves as having control over our world, our space, our lived experience. And finally, the unfolding of climate change is one more disproportionate assault on BIPOC communities and vulnerable populations is disproportionately experienced. One more disproportionately experienced issue. It's incredibly important that if we're doing social justice work and we're interested in the lived experiences of our BIPOC neighbors, that we add climate change and environmental justice into the mix. So basically, we will all be in the same storm, but in different boats. And that's really important to hold on to. So how does this intersect with mental health? And I'll just give you a whole bunch of stuff and then I'll pause. I promise I'll pause at some point. I do pause, but I'm also half Maltese. So when I get on a roll, there's like no stopping me. Like that Mediterranean side is a talker. So couple things to keep in mind. I'm going to give you sort of a couple sets of threes when it comes to understanding the mental health intersection with climate change. First of all, there are a number of significant reports that are at the very end of your slides that are international reports, UN reports that have specific chapters on public health and mental health impacts of the climate crisis. There's an abundance of evidence that we are going to have mental health implications beyond what we've typically seen and known from typical disasters. This will increase. And so there's plenty of resources that will help support that. I'm happy to share anything as well. And so researchers are predicting a sharp rise in mental health issues in the coming years. And this includes depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use, suicide, outbreaks of violence. The elderly, the poor, and our vulnerable neighbors are going to continue to be the first impacted and the most vulnerable to these changes. And so how do we experience climate change? We sort of experience it from three different directions. One is the mental health impact of hearing about, examining, and being realistic about the climate crisis. So even if you haven't directly experienced it, but you've chosen to be informed, the weight and the intensity of that is enough to have a mental health impact, is enough for our clients to bring this up in session. And maybe they don't say the word climate change, but maybe they're talking about the report that there are 7 to 11 predicted hurricanes coming to the Gulf this year. Maybe they're not saying, I'm worried about the climate change impact on hurricanes. Maybe they're saying, oh, did you see the NOAA report? I don't know how we brace ourselves for this again. We just got over this. And so people's description of how they're absorbing the news and how it impacts them might not use the words climate change, but they'll be talking about the conditions around it and how it impacts them. The second is mental health issues that are already existing and that are exacerbated by the outcomes of the climate crisis. So anyone who's being impacted, gosh, like most of y'all, by heat and drought, by displacement, whether it's by choice or whether you have to move. There are a lot of people who are saying, I can't be in this again this year. I can't put my family at risk again. And so there's displacement that's also feels like it's by choice, but it's also like I've reached a threshold of I can't live like this anymore. Or, you know, if people are experiencing a disaster and already have pre-existing mental health conditions. So these are people who have something existing already that's being exacerbated by the conditions of climate change. And the final one is the mental health issues that are directly caused by the impact of some aspect of climate change. This is typically where we think about disaster mental health response as a way to kind of triage or early intervention. But these are people who have had something specific happen and are having outcomes as a result. The other thing to keep in mind is that understanding the trauma that people experience as a result of climate change also is a matter of sort of understanding our vulnerability. So if we acknowledge that there's trauma from climate-related events or conditions, then we also are simultaneously acknowledging the vulnerability to the climate. So we're kind of holding two things at once that are personally important, as well as important when you consider your community. Make sense so far? Okay. I'll say a couple more things, then I promise I'll take a little pause before I move on to the next section. And so there's 3 kinds of traumatic stress I want you to sort of ponder and wonder about as we talk about this. The first one is this idea of a pre-traumatic stress. This parallels that first idea that I gave you, that people who are thinking about, realizing, anticipating the impact of climate change will experience some type of pre-traumatic stress. I think, Baby, you mentioned you work with college students, and I live in a dorm. I'm sitting in a dorm. So, at some point my light's going to go out. It's going to be really weird in here. But anyway, and I'm really sad, I think, about the weight that our young people are carrying, and the pre-traumatic stress, the worry that they have about what's to come in their future and what their future will look like, and the responsibility that they carry for trying to preserve their own future. So there's, while many people might not be experiencing the direct impact, they may be feeling that anticipatory or pre-traumatic nature of it. And again, this is not a diagnosable disorder, but I will say it is logical, rational, understandable, and a really intuitive response to an actual threat. So pre-traumatic stress is very real, and it's founded on something very real. The second one is sort of this post-traumatic or acute stress. And these are for people who are reacting to something that they've experienced. So this is the idea of disaster response, extreme weather events, any kind of acute stress that could result in some type of constellation of PTSD symptoms. So it doesn't have to be the full diagnosis, but they may be experiencing post-traumatic symptoms from something. This also, to me, speaks really loudly about why our disaster mental health competencies need to be climate informed, to really capture the fact that people are not only experiencing singular events, but most of the time they're experiencing a singular event with the anticipation of another one, and another season, and another hurricane season, or fire season, or flood season, or drought season. And so the post-traumatic or acute stress is also packaged with the reality that things will come again. Whereas old disaster response models were more of a one and done, like, oh, here's an unusual occurrence, and we're going to help people recover from it. Now we're having people who are going to recover, and then are probably going to be impacted again. So the awareness of this post-traumatic stress says we also have to be aware people will be repeatedly exposed in some areas. And the final one is this sort of ongoing trauma, like a continuous traumatic stress. And this is from continuous climate disruptions. I talked to the Louisiana Counseling Association a couple months ago, and I had like 160 people show up. Why? Because they live this all the time. They wait for the hurricane report to come out, and they know that the coastal area is going to be impacted. The continual traumatic stress, the cumulative and pervasive effects. My husband and I are doing a cross-country trip starting Friday. We'll be out in most of y'all's neighborhood, not Malaysia, but everywhere else, pretty much on the screen in front of me. And I'm really aware that you're hot and dry and on fire. That's a stress. There's no way to avoid that. And so all of you are living under some type of continuous traumatic stress from this. Okay. So I want to pause right here because I've been talking for a few minutes, and I want to see if you have any thoughts or reactions before I add. Okay. So oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I didn't. I mean, I think about this like a smaller event, but I didn't see it from a bigger picture of like a climate change.
Yeah.
Like I see like fires or flooded, flood, but I never like see it from a climate change lens, like from a bigger picture that is like ongoing thing. And I can't imagine for like New Orleans, like Louisiana, they have hurricanes every year, and yeah, like there's ongoing traumatic stress, and didn't even think about that. That it's a bigger picture than just single events.
Yeah, and that makes sense because that's where we've been for a very long time, is conceptualizing things as these singular events. But now, as climate change accelerates, they're getting threaded together, and the frequency, intensity, and duration are greater. I was talking to, it was really interesting. I was talking to people in South Dakota at their counseling association, and I had to do a lot of research on like what's going on in South Dakota that's climate change related. One of the things that we all kind of processed during the talk was that a lot of their little towns are struggling because they're not getting the water that they need for the ranching and for cattle and for growing, and as a result, this next generation is saying, I can't do farming, like I need to leave. And so their towns are actually seeing the younger people leaving. They're seeing the disruption of sort of history and legacy, and family is being separated in a way that they haven't done in the past. And so sometimes the impact of climate change is about like this disruption. It's about sort of this necessary migration away from tradition and history and community. And they're seeing a change in who they are at the very core of identity, and also seeing the economic impact of what happens when your young people leave, and when older people can't continue to do the same kind of work. And so there's sort of a grief and a loss in community as a result. So it's kind of interesting, like the different ways that it shows up in different places. Okay. Anybody else have something before I?
So for me, the that quote that you said, that we're in the same storm, but we're in different boats. Mm-hmm. For me, that really like resonated. That it's just an observation. That's just a thought that it really was impactful, and especially the impact that it has on BIPOC communities. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really, really impactful.
Yeah, it's a lot to hold. I hope you'll like let that marinate, because a lot to think about. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about that, because the reality is that vulnerable populations, those that we're already committed to from a social justice perspective as counselors, are also the people who are most vulnerable to climate change impact. And so it makes sense that we would consider climate change, climate justice, environmental justice as much a social justice issue in our work as sort of the other issues that we're facing. They're all united. There's a thread that runs through it all. And so this is just sort of one additional dimension that I'm offering you, again, because you have to listen to your heart and see like what's pulling me, what direction am I being pulled in, but also knowing that if we can do right by vulnerable populations, we can also do right by them with climate crisis and social justice and racial justice. So it's all related. So who will be most impacted are children because of their vulnerability, communities of color, low-income communities, and older adults. Coincidentally, if you do sort of some mapping, my husband's a GIS map guy, and so I don't do the mapping, but he does the mapping. If you look at things like Superfund sites, which are those almost like generationally rehabilitated chemical contamination spaces in the United States, so places that can't be fixed in a couple years, that are generations possibly of trying to get poison out of our soil. 99% of them are in proximity to BIPOC communities. Those also have a tremendous history as far as environmental justice issues of not having a voice, or say. They also don't have the resources to fight these things. So in addition to climate change, these communities are often in proximity to some of the more hazardous waste and petrochemical plants and other things that all kind of create this perfect storm when something else happens. So the impact of climate crisis also, when we think about children, and we talked a little bit about college students, but children as a population as a whole are probably some of our most vulnerable because they don't have a lot of decision-making power. And yet, I'll tell you, when I did the climate reality training, they had some of the youth movement youths who spoke to us. I have never imagined a collection of human beings of any age with the clarity, the drive, the purpose, the message that they had. It was so profoundly powerful. And so I think there's sort of an interesting, almost like dichotomy with the vulnerability that they hold and yet the power that is also present in this generation. And it's something for us to be really mindful of as we think about another dichotomy of like how much responsibility this generation feels that they hold, as well as how much we can sort of not put the responsibility on them. It's again this really interesting place to navigate. But if you spend any time listening to the voices of the youth climate movement, it is I honestly like sort of left that conversation like, what do I do? I'm a 55-year-old woman. I got access. I got a PhD. I've got means, and I listen to these 14 and 15-year-olds, and they are powerful. And so, how do we create space? We got a grant from Walden University, a couple of us, and one of the things we're trying to study is the possibility of school counselors partnering with science and environmental educators in middle school and high school to help make sure that they're attending to the emotional impact of students' growing awareness of threat as they learn about changing climate in school. Like, can we create a partnership where the school counselors can actually work with the science educators and do things like bring in change makers from their community, bring in people who can talk about sense of place and tradition and agriculture and our animals and the plants, and like get students to know the people who are taking care of their place, as well as support them as they face the reality of what their future could be and bear the responsibility on themselves. So it's important to figure out, like, how do we support our youth and how do we hear this from them and really honor that. I read an interesting article. I think it was in the New York Times, and it said, communities of color are first and worst hurt. And I thought that first and worst was a really powerful takeaway from me. And this is because they are disproportionately exposed to urban heat. Just one thing to think about, like they don't typically have as many trees in their neighborhood. And just think about trees. It can reduce the ground temperature by 30 degrees. When it's 120 outside, 30 degrees is everything for survival, for comfort, for just, it's survival at that point. And so they are definitely exposed to higher urban heat. They're disproportionately exposed to environmental injustices, including, as I said before, Superfund sites, toxins, proximity to chemical waste. And then they have challenges as far as when something does happen, can they just get in a car? Can they drive away? Can they go stay with somebody else somewhere else? Or is all their family local? Is their community local? Can they return to a community that's been damaged? Do they have flood insurance? And so being mindful that communities of color are first and worst hurt, because it's not just because of where the hurricane lands, it's because of generations of societal structures that have added layers of complexity for them. So, and so that kind of brings me just to this idea of environmental justice, which has been in place since the 1970s. And typically environmental justice is really about the fair and meaningful treatment of all people and the opportunity for voice in what happens around you. And environmental justice is sort of as part of government, but it's also a thread in many other ways. And so it's a good thing to pay attention to, like, where are the current environmental justice issues? Where are the things in your own community that are threats to, here it's getting dark in my room now. Oh my gosh, hang on 1 second so I can stand up and make it light again. Okay. Life in a dorm. Okay. So I think that one of the valuable things we can do is pay attention to where some of the environmental justice issues are close to us. What's in your community that poses a threat to your neighbors? What's in your community that poses a threat to your clients? So that when something does happen, you know, and you can bring it up. You can share with your client, like, you know, this drought is hitting really hard, but I also know that y'all are in proximity to the hog farm and the waste there. Like, is that getting in your water? Are you guys feeling safe? Is this frightening for you? So can you hold the knowledge of your own community when it comes to environmental justice issues? And then finally, this is sort of this intersection of social justice, environmental justice, it all comes together in the climate justice. And climate justice recognizes that our most vulnerable are our most vulnerable. And that there's a complexity of generations of issues, social issues and environmental issues that are compounding the threat that they're going to experience, and that we need to be aware of what that is in our community. All right, I'll pause here and see if there's anything that y'all would like to add or question. Let me just keep adding. I'll add some more and then I'll take another pause. All right, so one of the things I'm guessing you're wondering is like, holy heck, there's a lot. What in the world do I do with this as a counselor? And so I want to give you some ideas of what this could sound like. So if people are bringing climate change issues to session, again, it's unlikely and not impossible, but oftentimes this is more about the conditions that they're experiencing than it is about the actual issue of climate change. They're the same, but the language is different. So sometimes we might hear things in our own narratives. So how does this sound for you? Or in our clients that could be talking about sense of place. A place that I love is being harmed. A place that I love is gone. A place that I love has changed so much I can't go back there. We have deep place connections and place attachments similar that we have to attachments to people. Place attachment is, I mean, for some of us, for me, I'm a hardcore, I am such a place attachment person, almost like a friend. You know, I will attach to places or recognize a place that I've never been. Places are really important. So it's important to ask yourself, do you have those places and what's happening in those places and to those places? Because I'm guessing you're feeling it and your clients are feeling it about their places too. Solastalgia is one of my favorite words, but it's heart-wrenching because it's a longing for something that is no longer as far as a place goes. So it might be someplace you grew up that is no longer. I have a wonderful friend here. She's the coolest lady in the world. She's an anthropologist, archaeologist, and she studies sort of heritage. So she studies the story of a place, and her work, as she's sort of shifting now, is trying to hurry up and preserve story of place and heritage before climate change claims it. So in Virginia, we've got the eroding coastline and sea level rise, and we're losing a lot of heritage. We're losing parts of the Great Dismal Swamp, which is where the enslaved Africans escaped and made their own community in the depths of the swamps. And it was an extraordinarily culture-ridden community, but a lot of the remnants of their story are starting to disappear because of sea level rise. And so there's aspects that go beyond the here and now and look back at our story and our history, and they're getting lost. And there are people trying to preserve it, but it might sound like that. It might sound like that from your client or from yourself. It might sound like trauma response and pre-traumatic stress, things that people are worried about or anxious about. News of the fire forecast, the hurricane forecast, news of flooding coming, news of something could be impacting them. And then the concern over livelihood, extreme weather. And what it also might sound like is just recognizing your vulnerabilities. Like, we're under threat, we're seeing something change. What happens if those vulnerabilities in your particular community are exposed? Who's at risk? We have I was doing some research on, they did sort of an evacuation plan for the Norfolk area in Virginia, so it's out on the coast. And it was just really interesting to me that, you know, this city out on the coast where Old Dominion University is has an evacuation plan, like not just a temporary like evacuation plan, but a refugee relocation plan, that as Norfolk becomes too inundated with seawater to live, they have a plan for where to move. They're citizens now. And when you kind of realize that like 3 hours away from you is a climate refugee relocation plan, that brings up some thoughts about vulnerabilities. And so what are the vulnerabilities in your community? Are there people having conversations about this? Can we be at that table? We understand trauma and resiliency. Can we be at that table? But that's what some of this might sound like, is the worries over the impact versus the concern over the actual words of climate change that we might read about. All right. Let's see, we're at 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock, yeah. I want to see what makes sense to give you. I'm going to give you a couple of words. I gave you a bunch of them here. And these are just sort of variables that I think are important to think about. Some of these being like, the research is beyond overwhelming that our connection to the natural world is good for us. And therefore, harm to the natural world is really harm to ourselves. Failure to protect the natural world is failing to protect ourselves. And so there's an interconnectedness that's critical. And it's something that as counselors to really understand that the natural world is part of who we are. And so how do we bring that awareness into the counseling room? How do we recognize our attachment to and our thriving in connection with the natural world? You know, so much of this is about so much of the pain that we feel when we think about climate change. So this pre-traumatic stress is about empathy. It's about connection. So when we think about the connection that we have to places, to nature, to animals, to other people, it's a really empathic response to feel despair over what will be lost. I don't know if y'all have seen the movie Chasing Ice. It's probably about 10 years ago, but it was about the largest glacier calving ever caught on camera. And my husband and I went to see it. We're the only people in the movie theater because, like, who goes and watches a movie about glaciers? We do. So we're sitting in the movie theater by ourselves. And at the point where the glacier calved, which means it sort of broke off and it was so huge and it rolled, and the sound that it made, I just burst into tears. Like I feel choked up now. It was just the weirdest thing. I was like, I'm crying and I still get teared up about a glacier. And it took me a while to kind of process it, but it's just so symbolic of such loss. And I think it's important to like feel that and understand it and realize like our empathic connection to our world is powerful. And how do you honor that? It's not something that we talk about in our field. like that's a relationship that's incredibly deep and powerful for a lot of people. Other things that I just want to kind of add to your mix is just, again, sense of place and place attachment, solastalgia. I think in one of the early, in one of our conversations, we might have talked about, some people mentioned eco-anxiety, and like, how do you talk about eco-anxiety in session? What does it look like? What does it mean? For Earth Day, it was really interesting. I did 8 eco-anxiety to action groups for Silk almond milk. Random. And they were just open to anybody from anywhere to join. There's nothing like a group to give you dimension to a construct. And so to say like, hey, come here, let's talk about your eco-anxiety, let's deconstruct it a little bit, figure out what's behind it, and kind of develop your sense of action out of like what's sitting behind your anxiety, what propels you. And I had anywhere from 12 to 15 people every hour from all over the world, all different ages. And it was really powerful to hear that their anxiety, their sense of eco-anxiety was unique to each person. And the reason for it was unique to each person. And the action that they thought about taking was unique to each person. So much like anxiety in general, it's a constellation of symptoms that are fueled by our lived experience. And it's really unique and it's really personal. The good thing is we've given a word to a feeling so that people can name it and can own it and can pull it apart a little bit and then try to do something with it. It's also a byproduct of the empathy that we feel. And one thing that I think is really interesting is like empathy propels us to connect. So when we know that the anxiety that we're feeling is a byproduct of the empathy that we're feeling, one of the things that we feel propelled to is to connect with others and talk about it. And the other thing is, I always think anxiety is a catalyst for something. Like most of our counseling theories have some kind of version of like anxiety propels you. So the empathy calls us to connect, anxiety propels us to act. And so sitting within just the very nature of eco-anxiety is a call for connection and action. And somewhere in our work with clients, you know, if we can give them space to really understand what this is for them, behind it seems to be connection and action. Sounds like a good thing to do. In this slideshow that I gave you, there's a ton of just examples of articles that have come out in all sorts of publications about we need to talk about eco-anxiety or growing ecological grief as the mental health cost of climate change. The impact of climate change on mental health, impossible to ignore, how the mental health community is bracing for the impact of climate change. Mental health cost of climate change, the mental health cost of climate change. So we are, as a profession, poised, if we can expand this conversation to really start to be attuned to what's happening, and give people space for a voice, and knowing that voice can lead to some kind of action or a sense of empowerment. Yeah. Okay, so I'll pause here again and see if there's anything that y'all want to add or reflect on.
This is Nalandra. I just wanted to say that what really struck me in everything that you were talking about tonight was, you know, people a lot of times think of this topic on such a large scale, but then tonight you mentioned, you know, a weather forecast. How many trees are in my neighborhood? You know, these are things that are so simple. These concepts can still, you know, be connected to really huge emotional responses, and can also be really complex for something that's so simple. And so I think that's what really struck me tonight was, you know, when you think of this topic, it's usually the glacier is falling, but what about the weather forecast and the anxiety that someone would get by reading that?
Right.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Bibi had a question too, Debbie.
Okay, good. Bibi.
I was just thinking about the small things that we do, like Nalindra was just saying. Some of my clients, it started, hey, we're dealing with racialized trauma by protesting. Advocacy is kind of written into our practice as an intervention. Mm-hmm. So then August hits, and we had a series of fires in Oregon that just kind of shut everything down. And so that jacked the anxiety back up. And so we kind of pivoted with the advocacy, and what the students were doing were finding projects locally, because in Portland specifically, a lot of the parks are in the nicer, richer neighborhoods. So you can't connect to nature. Mm-hmm. So the very few parks that they do have, it's giant trucks through all the time. So what they started to do was count. They got together, they built a group, like you said. Mm-hmm. They started counting trucks, what companies are going through this way instead of taking the highways and the freeways around the neighborhood, and then calling those companies and challenging. It's just kind of another way to put some of the anger that they'd been feeling this whole past year. They've been working so hard protesting. Mm-hmm. And then on top of everything else, we have, now they're learning about environmental justice. Mm-hmm. And so they're just kind of using this same advocacy practices for this. And I just thought, oh yeah, man, these kids are smart.
Oh my gosh. They're remarkable. And I think there's also that weight of, gosh, it's a shame that they need to be, I think there's like a grief component to it of like, dang, it's not okay, but they're extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see, who else?
Minju, I think, had a raised hand, and then Lauren after that.
Okay, Minju.
Yeah, I want to share my experience in my therapy and how it speaks to me. Pacific Northwest was hit by the extreme record-breaking heat wave a few weeks ago, which almost paralyzed the cities. For example, in Washington, emergency rooms were flooded, thousands of people suffering from heat exhaustion, dehydration, or loss of consciousness. The temperature was like 100 to 110 degrees. So people in Nevada or Arizona might say, we always deal with that kind of heat, which is true. But in Pacific Northwest, it was so sudden. We're not used to this. We're not prepared. For example, most of the houses in Pacific Northwest don't have AC because the normal temperature in summer is like 85. So we normally don't need AC. So a lot of people reported acute stress in therapy sessions and through social media. And based on the conversation in therapy community, it was pretty chaotic, like a lot of no-shows, late cancellations, or even the therapists canceled the whole day because they couldn't work. Mm-hmm. So, we're like, wow, climate change is real, because in Pacific Northwest, we're pretty much blessed with beautiful nature, and we've been free from natural disasters, but finally it's hitting Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
So I'm like, what I'm taking today is we can't ignore this anymore as an individual, as well as a therapist. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate what you bring today and your research and attention and all.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think what you're speaking to is just that realization of your own vulnerability. And, for many people, there's been enough of a distance that you could think of it as like this theoretical thing that's going to happen versus I'm living the vulnerability right now. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Lauren.
Yeah, I just wanted to name, first of all, that I'm getting so much out of this conversation today. You know, I do a lot of trauma work, and usually what that consists of, or maybe like one of the principles of the work, is holding the reality of right now and the safety that that brings with the trauma experience. And, you know, holding the dual awareness of those things creates a space for healing. And it's really challenging for me when a client has a lot of anxiety about the environment and climate change, because I don't have the capacity to ground them in the safety of right now. You know, like that part doesn't exist when we're having fires and the outside is orange. You know, like it's really hard to try to create safety in that. And I guess the thing I'm curious about is, I recently heard the stat of, I think it's like 7 corporations produce 71% of emissions or something like that. And I probably messed up that stat, but I guess my question is, when we do have a place in our work with clients where they're motivated towards creating change and to moving towards the action stages of wanting to do something with their anxiety, what do you typically recommend? Or like what things have felt useful for you in your experience of helping clients channel that energy?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. It's probably one of the most common ones that comes up in this discussion, is like, how do you help people figure out what to do? And I tend to, and I've been to a couple presentations similar to this as well, where the tendency is to help the client figure out what's going on for them. Like, what is the characteristic of their unique fear or anxiety? What sits behind it? Because it's attached to something. It's attached to something intensely personal and vulnerable. And whether that's the future for your children, whether that's losing your home, whether that's a loss of a place, whether that's feeling economically so insecure that you don't know how you would handle that. I mean, there's a thing behind the anxiety. And when you can figure out what that thing is, it kind of creates the pathway to what your unique action is and what your meaningful action is. Because we can do a lot of things individually that feel like you're doing something, and we should never give those up. So don't get me wrong, like, although I have a straw and I'm a horrible straw person, but I do a lot of good things. And I know, like, behind my climate anxiety, it has a lot to do with place, and it has a lot to do with vulnerable people. And it has a lot to do with like people not making the connection. So where's my action? Communication. And so when you figure out like what your stuff is that's connected to the anxiety, then you can find your personal antidote that really starts to feel like you're doing something that's meaningful and an extension of yourself. I think in many ways, like real leadership identity, real advocacy identity, real movement has to be a part of who you are. And so we work with clients to figure out, what is this to you and where can you make movement there? Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so I put a bunch of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just interject real quick, Debbie. So we have a 9:30 stop time, so we have about 14 minutes left. I would love if other people had thoughts or comments or questions. I know Debbie would too. And then if you had something to say too in a second, Debbie. But I was interested. Let me put this in the chat. This was the resource that Dr. Sturm mentioned earlier from Al Gore. Has a lot of good information, research data, that sort of thing there. But I loved one of your slides at the end. Dr. Sturm had the words radical hope.
Oh yeah.
You know, and it's easy to, like you mentioned kind of at the beginning of this, to feel completely overwhelmed. And I think that's a partly a right feeling for sure, you know, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of those couple words, because that just intrigues us. I think as counselors, I think that's why we do what we do. Yeah. We instill hope. And so just your thoughts about that, and then please feel free to continue what you were going to say too.
So radical hope might be my favorite thing in the world, because it's two hands. It's a both and situation where you have to hold the darkness. You have to do the work. You have to see what's really happening. You have to peel back the layers and see the reality. And you also have to spend the time and look for where the solutions are, where the hope is, where the possibility, where the youth voices, where, where really cool, interesting things are happening. Our tendency is to see this and go, how about that? It's like, that's just a natural tendency. Radical hope is the belief that we can hold both of those at the same time equally. And we need to, in order to do the work. We need to do both. And I think this is across the board true, whether it's with racial justice, whether it's environmental justice, climate change, like any of these tremendous injustices that are complex as all get out. We have to hold both in order to do the work. If we look away from the hard part, we're missing the critical nuance that makes all the difference. And, it doesn't mean like deep dive into it and suffer, but it means like hold both. And, I think when I heard that term, I was like, this is everything. This is everything. You have to do both. Radical hope t-shirt or something. Yeah.
You better act quick on it. That's
awesome.
Love that term.
I do.
Were you going to say something else a second ago too?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of like direct y'all to so at the very end of this, I and it takes me back to the advocacy competencies that I shared. So as you're trying to figure out your own leadership and advocacy identity and who you are and how you make a difference, there's so many ways to figure out your point in all of this. And maybe it's one-on-one with clients, or maybe it's big systems movement. It doesn't matter. It just matters that you sort of find your way. And we did all this stuff with the task force with ACA. We're a tiny little group of 5 people. I don't even know if we're a task force anymore, to be honest with you. The new president hasn't said it. So, but we're still this like tiny, mighty group of people that are like, let's create some things to get the message out. We've created webinars with ACA. We've put some articles in Counseling Today. And we have a task force fact sheet that's in this that you can click on. We created an award for environmental justice. We put a book chapter in a family book because one of the guys on our task force is the author of the book. We're like, let's write a book chapter about climate change. And so the point is, like, you can figure out like what your place is, what speaks to you, what matters. There's so many avenues. And I think one of the things that I wrestle with at times is that I don't know if it's a profession or if it's sort of people in general, but there can be a lot of valuing of, is your advocacy good enough? Is it the right kind of advocacy? Are you using we've got to do something. Like, we can't sort of get like frozen by trying to make sure we're doing the right thing. And so please, if there's something that you heard today that like moved you, hang up and like Google it and look for it and see what's happening around you. See what there's a really cool climate vulnerabilities assessment on the NOAA website. So you look at NOAA climate resilience, and they have like a vulnerabilities thing that you can map your area and see what are the vulnerabilities in your area, who lives near those, who's impacted by those, and then put those people on your radar. Pay attention like when they're in your office or when something happens. So there's little things that you can do that aren't little, they're not leading a protest down the street, but that's okay, because if you can tell a client, like, when you were flooded, like, did you guys have any impact on your water because of the petrochemical plant? Is your soil okay? How are your kids feeling? If you can say that, holy heck, you made a huge difference. So check what's going on in your community, know your neighbors' vulnerabilities. And if we all do that, wow. Wow. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Does anyone else have any just last moment questions for Dr. Sturm?
Dr. Sturm, I just wanted to say, like, I really appreciate you kind of
just extending an invitation into an overwhelming conversation in a really digestible way. When you, throughout the whole presentation, I was just like, well, yeah, this is connected to this, and this is connected to this, and of course our generation's moving away from things that are uncomfortable because we live in a society that doesn't sit in discomfort well, and then we lose the wisdom of our ancestors. We transition and then full circle come back with so much loss in the process. And thinking about all the different aspects that you brought up that I didn't even consider, feeling the overwhelm, and also at the same time coming back to, it comes down to what is your connection, what is being able to regulate your system, like you said so beautifully, so that we can sit with the fullness and the realness of what is happening, with this compassionate stance for ourselves and for each other. And so it's just, and then with that movement towards finding what is unique to us. And so much of that movement is relearning how to be in tune with ourselves. And I think in a society that kind of puts us in this box and in these four walls and so detached from our environment, it's easy to forget that there's a heat wave if you have air conditioning. And so, coming back to that, to us, to even the sense of regulating our own systems so that we can sit in it, so that we can engage. This is really powerful and really beautiful. So I wanted to thank you for that.
I just sort of am bouncing that back to you as well. What you shared just now is really powerful and beautiful too. So thank you for that.
I have less of a question and more of a comment to just say thank you. I think this has been truly an inspiring conversation. And I think that while many of us in the work that we do are positioned to see gaps and room for growth in many areas, few of us are able to truly answer that call to that question of what are you going to do about it? And you are evidence of living and breathing that answer. So I just want to applaud you and say thank you for all of the work that you continue to do, but also for inspiring all of us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, and I'm kind of overwhelmed by it. And I think the fact that y'all showed up, like, you can't help but be, there'll be a conversation that you're having with yourself tonight about what does this mean to me? And that's, what else could I imagine asking for? It's just powerful. So thank you for being here. I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, like, nobody showed up. So like every time people show up, I'm like, oh, there's people who want to talk about this. Like, change is happening. So
yeah, I want to just echo some of my colleagues, what they were just saying. I think I wanted to comment on your radical hope. I just wanted to make a comment that was actually pretty powerful when you said it. We say that all the time in the therapy room, right? Like holding hard things and hope. But the way you couched it with what we're talking about, the topic tonight, is huge. I think for me, it kind of made me say, okay, it is dark, but there is hope. And so how do we prepare? How do we mobilize? I know I do EMDR, and in the EMDR community, there's the HAP, the Humanitarian Assistant Program, who goes into underserved communities and train EMDR to clinicians. And I just had this kind of vision in my mind, like, we're going to have more and more of these, sadly, the dark part, these situations, and we're going to have trauma. And how can we just have sort of an army of clinicians that can help and serve? So I just wanted to share that with you, sort of a picture I just had. And I know it's hard on Zoom, but
it's cool.
Just wanted to share that with you. And thank you for sharing this really important topic.
Thank you. That was really cool to hear.
Debbie, I didn't see your contact on your PowerPoint. Would you be okay to put that in the chat? Your email or whatever email is available?
Yeah.
And everyone, I just wanted to thank you so much for this intriguing presentation. And So I don't know how you all do it on Zoom. Me and my students, we either give all kinds of different things, but you can feel free to use one of the reactions, the clap or the thumbs up or the celebration or whatever. But thank you so much, Dr. Sturm, for an excellent presentation.